All right, so we're going to have John Cromer from Sol-Ark join us and Lucas Miller from Mayfield Renewables, and we're going to be talking about some of these technical advancements and in the microgrid space. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lucas.
Thanks, Ryan. How's it feel to be in the hot seat, Ryan?
I'm not sure if this is hot or not, so
Yeah.
we'll see how this goes.
Great. Well, like Ryan mentioned, we're here to spend the next 20 or 30 minutes to really turn our attention a little bit more technical, more on the product side, codes and standards side, and hopefully leave you with some teasers for some of the sessions we're going to have both today and tomorrow. But John, I'd love to start with you if you want to give us just a quick introduction on yourself, your role, and a little bit about what Sol-Ark does.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I know many of you. I'm John Cromer. I've worked in solar since 2008. I've done the NABCEP PV+IP track, although I don't have an active certificate if you're going to check that. But I've worked as an installer. I've done REAP grant writing. I've done commercial projects, and then kind of since COVID, I moved into working on the manufacturing side, first in lithium iron phosphate battery manufacturing, and now with Sol-Ark making hybrid inverters. Sol-Ark, I think as a company, it exists because of a first market advantage with residential hybrid inverters, and that market segment has only grown with time. Now we're doing the same thing with commercial. So we've done hundreds of commercial microgrids just in the past year, mostly through the NABCEP community. So it's definitely a market opportunity, and come stop by our table and have a good conversation with us.
Thanks, John. Ryan, you've already been on stage for a while, so I don't know if we need to do a formal intro. We are at the Mayfield Education Summit. If anyone has a notebook, that's Ryan's cartoon on the front of it. So maybe instead of an intro, I'll give you just a softball.
Okay.
Favorite edition of the NEC?
Oh, oh man. Can I go back to, I guess, 84 when 690 got introduced? And during one of my classes, I actually just planted the seed that, hey, that's when 690 got put in, and I don't have that copy. And a week later, I'm not kidding, copy of 1984 NEC showed up in my mail. So thank you, Keith. I don't think Keith is here, but Keith sent me that issue. So I'll go with that, even though I haven't read it. So I'll admit that.
Love it.
But thank you for bringing code up, because it's been 20 minutes. I'm getting a little itchy on not talking about it.
Well, we'll be right back there shortly.
Okay.
So a couple questions away. First one, though, let's start with you here, John. So Sol-Ark started out with a bit more residential focus, and again, they have a booth just outside this room, so you can check out some of their products. Over the past few years, you've shifted to focus a bit more in the commercial space. So talk to us a bit about what's behind that transition and why you're bullish about the C&I sector.
Yeah, I mean, Sol-Ark over the last, I'd say, year and a half has gone from a small amount of commercial to somewhere between a third to half our business now is in commercial. I, as an installer, I took that path about 3 years into my solar journey, and my first commercial project was like twice the size of my past 3 years of residential projects, back when we were selling 4 kilowatt projects and stuff like that. But that was pretty nice, because I could do fewer projects, more profitable projects, and so Sol-Ark has done that now. I think that commercial, it was hard for the solar market to access the commercial space because of rate structures. And what made commercial difficult for solar only makes it very advantageous for microgrid solar plus battery. So it's almost like, there's this untapped, low-hanging fruit market in commercial that's just now emerging. I don't think the commercial microgrid moment has had its Tesla Powerwall 1 moment that residential had, where all of a sudden every homeowner runs out and buys a battery. I think we're on the cusp of that in commercial, where every business runs out and buys a battery. So why wouldn't you want to be in on that market?
Ryan, same question for you. At Mayfield, when I first came on board, we were also developing residential plan sets, and nowadays it's much more complex and really wholly focused on the middle market. So maybe first, how do you define the middle market, and why was that a strategic decision to move toward that market?
For Mayfield, we were doing, when I started the company, it was kind of like whatever work we could get. And so residential was a big part of that. So we were doing residential plan sets. And then a few years ago, we made the very conscious effort of exiting that market, focusing in on middle market. So these behind the meter projects that are, upwards of a couple megawatts often. Sometimes they're larger, but really anything behind the meter is kind of where we would fall in. And these commercial projects, they are more complex. There's just a lot more to them. They're, in my opinion, a lot more interesting. As I mentioned at the beginning of the last panel, they're more interesting. There's a lot of projects that are doing great things for communities. And so getting in on those and working on those, I think was a really important thing, and setting ourselves apart in terms of that expertise and doing these projects that, quite honestly, some other people were not wanting to do. That was a big part of it for us. And I mean, this goes back, and John, you probably saw this, of when there was, when we start seeing the batteries coming into the market, there was actually contractors trying not to sell batteries. They were like actively trying to dissuade people from going with batteries. And so we kind of leaned into the opposite side, and for us, it's paid off well. It's something that I think our team really enjoys, even though on the walk last night, I was hearing some talk about some of the projects that were going on, and there's definitely headaches. There's definitely things that are harder about this, but I also think that's part of the fun part of it. The joy of it is it's not a cookie cutter, and that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to lean into that.
So John, in this middle market space is really broad, right? It's everything from like a middle school to a college campus, a data center to a corner store, and kind of everything in between. And in line with that, we've seen commercial scale batteries also have a broad range of sizes. So everything from a full-on container and a 20-foot skid to a large cabinet to Sol-Ark has small scale units. So what's behind your decision to fit more on the small form factor, small capacity end of that commercial sector?
Yeah, there are containerized solutions that are very cost effective, and you can do multiple megawatt hours, and industrial utility scale players will execute those projects. But there's also a market for smaller commercial projects, and I think the thing that I've learned is you don't necessarily want to treat a commercial project like how a commercial solar project is really just a scaled up, residential solar project from the eyes of a contractor moving from residential to commercial. But in commercial, because of how the rate structures are, like peak energy is only a part of total energy. And so that let's scale up the project to get a low dollar per watt cost, playbook in solar is not absolutely necessary in commercial. You can have a small project on a large site and have that be very cost effective and affordable and easy to sell. So, even on larger containerized solutions, companies will use Sol-Ark just to do seamless transfer for a small part of that project. And what I like about the commercial project, a small project on a large site, is it can actually play into that residential essential load panel backup knowledge from kind of old school battery design for residential. But at the commercial scale, the facilities are already divided up into subpanels. So you can go in and ask the facility manager go to the control room, look at the panel board, say which distribution panel is the most important to your facility, and that becomes the interconnection point, and it's a project the CFO can just write a check for. So very quick, very rapid. Peak shaving in industrial sites, they need to have a 4 or 5 year simple payback, or they just will not come out of the ground. And when you add essential backup, it is not the same risk as whole building backup. Lower loads, more successful transfer and switching. But the project can then tolerate a slightly longer simple payback that might be more realistic. So, it's a large market, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and just, actually, it seems to me that the industrial sites, whether they're large or small, are easier to site, and so they come out of the ground more rapidly than commercial sites that have more kind of public exposure. So that could be like a metal fabrication shop or a auto body repair shop, but just like closed off access to the public sites, whether large or small, on demand rate structures. That's really where you start narrowing it down to like what can fly off the shelf, next year amid all the policy changes going on.
Yeah, a term that you'd used in our prep for this, John, was almost a reverse economy of scale for commercial, where, I don't know if you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, it's a reverse economies of scale because you almost want to intentionally do just a part of the project, not the entirety of the project. And so that means a smaller project with a higher dollar per kilowatt hour installation price can have a similar payback as a larger scaled up with a lower dollar per kilowatt hour because of the effective rate or the effective generation rate of the microgrid.
And when we get to the small scale, not full facility backup, I think that's where maybe even the importance of a feasibility study, preliminary engineering, can become even more important. And I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Ryan, or thoughts on our approach.
Yeah, something that you said there, John, and really stuck with me. And so going into the facilities, there's sometimes already backup panel that's, there's a generator already there. And so it's like really easy to identify. These are the loads we're going to back up. We're already backing up. And that's great. It adds its own level of complexity. Just one of the things, I'll warn people of this when we're talking about codes in the classes, you do kind of get into some different realms sometimes if it's an emergency versus a backup. And so those words matter. And the other part is, talking to the facility manager, that's great. And that's this kind of ties into the last panel a bit too. They often will also say, well, I want that load in that panel and that one in that panel. And there's one on the other side of campus that I really want that pump on here. And so being able to walk through and educate them of like, okay, well, sure, things are possible, but we need to, consider how are we actually going to make this work. And so having those conversations, and then the feasibility really ties into that. So understanding what these systems can do, we have been approached with engineering saying, we just sold 600 kilowatt hour battery system. We have a, 500 kilowatt PV array. Make it fit. Like put it on paper for us. And the questions are, well, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to do? What loads are you trying to serve? And blank stares. So it's happened, unfortunately, and it probably will continue to happen. So having that feasibility side, looking at the project holistically and understanding what it can and can't do, and the economics play a big part of it. What can it do for demand charge response? What can it do for energy arbitrage, not just resilience?
So let's stay with you here for a minute, Ryan. And Mayfield's been around since 2007. You've been working in renewables since 99. Having seen some of the early years of PV, is there anything we can learn from that? Any parallels you see from solar's growth to where batteries are now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, when I got my start, we were working almost exclusively with batteries, and they were all lead acid, and so we were doing a lot of off-grid stuff. And at the very beginning of my career is when grid-tied systems first started coming to the U.S. market, at least. And for those, remember the old sun-tie inverters and the first SMA Sunny Boy 1800s and 2500s, those were fun. But in the sense of this, in solar, there was this sense of scalability, like a 3 kilowatt system doesn't look a whole lot different than a 10 kilowatt system than it does a 15. It's kind of just scales and you just add more inverters and you put things in parallel. With batteries, that's not so much the case. With energy storage systems, there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of things that we get into, grid isolation, for example, working with utilities and understanding what their requirements are. And sometimes they don't even know what their requirements are. And so it's very different, especially in this middle market. So on the residential side, I think the market's got the systems pretty well figured out. The inverters can handle these interconnects and those kinds of things and isolation from the grid. when we get into these larger systems, there's a lot of times that isn't so clear. And one of the things that I would, if you are a contractor or a developer moving from residential into commercial world, one of the things that I would just, you don't know what you don't know, and I'm here to tell you you don't know a lot. And that's me from the future talking to you. So there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to put into play, and getting to understand the systems, how they actually work. And I think one of our biggest things as of late has been working with utilities and getting them comfortable with these because of that isolation. They're very used to engine generators, they're very used to manual or automatic transfer switch. That makes them feel very warm and cozy. You throw in an energy storage system that doesn't have that same double pull, double throw kind of aspect to it, it starts to get a lot harder.
Well, speaking of learning, good thing we're here this week. We're going to have a lot of different sessions on codes and standards in particular. And so a question I want to throw to both of you, maybe we start with you, John, is how do evolving product standards and the model codes that we follow lead to product advancement and vice versa?
Yeah, so the history of being a PV installer has always been follow National Electric Code and what edition of National Electric Code are you on. But with microgrids, your inspectors are much more likely to look at NFPA 855 or check out the edition of 9540 or 1741. These are standards that are dramatically changing every 3 years, and because 9540 and NFPA 855 and NFPA 68, 69, they don't have that historical 3-year delayed implementation that NFPA 70 or National Electric Code has. It's like as soon as the new codes and standards come out, some jurisdictions enforce them immediately. And so that's actually like a product development nightmare, because if you're first to market, then the listings change. And so like a good example would be our outdoor battery cabinet. When we put deflagration vents onto the battery cabinet, it wasn't a mandatory item. So we were going above and beyond what was required. Well, eventually deflagration vents make its way into 9540 or 1741, and our deflagration vents were too small. And so, that went from us having our own outdoor battery cabinet to really partnering with Discover for, a new outdoor battery cabinet that, is code compliant. So you really have to know, not just NEC 70 or NFPA 70, you have to know everything about all of the listings, dramatic differences between 9540 edition 2, where you have to co-list the inverter, versus edition 1 or edition 3, where you can have independently co-list, independent battery listings. And those had real ramifications across the industry. You had battery and inverter partners who were friends, being forced to compete with each other, and then able to go back to being just inverter and battery partners, all within a 9-year drama or epic that was 9540 revisions. So it's a lot to keep track of, and if you're in those jurisdictions where they enforce the codes and standards as immediately as they come out, you have to be very careful when speccing out your projects.
Yeah, so I think one of the things in terms of codes and standards as they relate to product development is, I think one of the things I would point out is specific to NEC and Article 706, which is energy storage. That first appeared in code in the 2017 version of code. And so you think back, it's like, oh, that was 8 years ago, that's a number of cycles, that's plenty of time. But it's really not in the grand scheme. I mean, 2017 was the first instance where this shows up. And so if you think about how the code making goes, that was really written in 2015. And so you can think of how much the industry has changed in these 10 years. And right now, the 2026 code just hit my door just last week. So super excited. Got my 2026 code book in my hands. And we're already talking about what does 29 look at. So having a conversation with Jason last night after dinner, instead of having after dinner drinks, we're sitting there talking about what are we going to do for the 29 code now, and what changes do we make, what's important, and just a little bit of a heads up, 29 is going to look a heck of a lot different. So if you're just starting to memorize code sections and numbers, just stop, don't worry about it, because it's going to change. But a lot of that drives what the manufacturers have to do. I mean, that deflagration event is a great example of Sol-Ark trying to get ahead of what is required and kind of going above and beyond, and then all of a sudden you're behind the curve because it changed in a way that was just, inches probably difference. And so we're going to see a lot of that, and again, it's one of those, is the tail wagging the dog? We don't know. It's because industry is trying to keep up, and code is trying to keep up with the industry, and so it's this constant cycle. And so just working, or manufacturers, thankfully, being there, being on the code making panels, knowing what their products can and can't do. There's a good example of that. I over drinks, happy to talk about this in Article 702, just this last code cycle. So there are things that we are seeing code kind of driving the market, and people are probably painfully aware of that with things like arc fault interruption in AFCIs and solar systems. And so there's these instances where code says you're going to do this, and it's like, well, it doesn't exist, and manufacturers have to jump on board and figure it out for us. So we're going to continue to see that. The industry is rapidly changing, and there's no way to stop that until things become static, and I just don't see that probably ever happening.
You mentioned the code making panel. What are some other ways that people who maybe don't represent a manufacturer can get involved in developing codes and standards? So yeah, that's a great question. So everybody has the opportunity to put in your public comment, which are due April for this code making cycle, which is a condensed version, kind of back to what I was alluding to with the big changes happening. So everybody has that opportunity to do that. The SEIA, so Solar Energy Industries Association, also hosts their forum or their group where really anybody from the industry can be involved. If you want to, you can get on that list. They'd be happy to have you to join that, and putting in those comments and trying to make those changes. Those are probably that one probably is the more effective way versus an individual. It's really hard to get a lot of airtime, if you will, as an individual to get the code making panel to sometimes take your stuff serious, because there's a lot of public comments. But when it comes from a industry organization like that, that really helps. And so that would be probably the best way that I would suggest for people to do that. So John, let's turn to policy for a moment. It's been kind of a whirlwind of a year in 2025, and we're going to cover a little bit of policy in some of our classes, but not too in depth. And I want to get your take as a manufacturer, particularly in the BESS space, on what developers need to know today, and more specifically about navigating safe harbor.
Yeah, I think GridVest is giving a presentation on safe harbor later, but it is something that's kind of, I'm very concerned about it, and it may not be a big deal. But every installer, NAPSEP installers, resi-commercial installers are really preoccupied with end-of-year residential 2025 closeout, as they should be. But what is looming in 2026 in commercial is, yes, the investment tax credit is available for batteries for commercial in 2026, but there will be not just domestic content rules, but basically non-Chinese content rules that Sol-Ark thinks we will be able to comply with and qualify projects for. But the guidance has not been issued on the fiat guidance. And if it is as rigorous as the domestic content safe harbor tables, it will be incredibly difficult to qualify projects for the tax credit next year. And the clarification of that guidance might not be issued till the end of next year. So a lot of uncertainty going into 2026 about the commercial tax credit, which may turn out to be no concern at all, or may be, even if you qualify for the tax credit, a lot more paperwork than you're used to for documenting your right to claim the tax credit at the commercial level. So all I can really advise is to sidestep those issues, at least for early 2026, by safe harboring your project in 2025. And what that means is, in December, any commercial project that you think is going to go in 2026, you need to get a down payment into the distributor's hands to document that you've made a purchase for that. So that might be aligning with construction financing, so the finance company can make that down payment. But you need to have a concerted sales effort in December to get commercial project down payments, so that if there is a meteor that hits the market unexpectedly with fiat compliance being as held to the same standards as domestic content compliance, that your company doesn't go down underwater in the process. So build your commercial pipeline for the first half of 2026. Safe harbor that in 2025. Don't just focus on the residential build out. You have to focus on the commercial pipeline build out too.
Well, I think we've got just a few minutes left, so let's close with two questions. So one looking backward, one looking forward. And I'll pitch this one to you, John. Ryan, feel free to jump in. On the battery side, in the last 2 or 3 years, these things are developing really quickly. What are the key parts or functions of our modern BESS systems that you think have brought us furthest along in the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest advancement is large form factor cells. And you can kind of predict the battery market. Batteries have cells and modules, and solar panels had cells and modules. And why did high quality, high density monosilicon kind of win out? And well, now we are seeing high quality and larger cell form factor for lithium iron phosphate went out. So that is lowering battery costs, and that has been able to so far eat tariff impacts and continue to have projects move forward. And then I also think that the demand charges in particular are going to skyrocket next year, because it's easier for utilities to increase commercial demand charges than residential energy charges, which are also increasing too. But when you think about peak shaving, you just need to get a little bit above $15 a kilowatt for demand charge. If you're in a market that has historically had a $10 a kilowatt demand charge, or $13 a kilowatt demand charge, I think those will spike next year, and it'll be time to really start figuring out how to do peak shaving with essential load backup. And that's a system that any business, large and small, can benefit from.
The thing I would tack onto that is exactly, ties right into that. And of course, the advancements in batteries are a huge part of this. But I would even say the ancillary things like the BMS, the battery management system, the EMS, the energy management, the power control systems, that's been a huge thing. And so seeing this shift and being able to control loads, being able to isolate loads and things like that. So through our controllers, through our microgrid controllers, and which we're going to have a whole session on, I know. But those types of components within the system and working with the entire electrical system, to me, that's been one of the biggest advancements in seeing where we're going with that. And just some of the things on the residential side, there's some really cool things, and the commercial side where there's some stuff coming through different UL listings and things like that. So to me, those are the big advancements.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, so keep that in mind. Last question. John, from a manufacturer perspective, Ryan, from a developer engineer perspective, we're hearing a lot of companies now that historically were focused on residential. They're seeing all these headwinds, all these opportunities, and starting to pivot to commercial. What tips would you give these companies that are starting to look at this new middle market and really want to go for it?
I'd say, especially if you find yourself doing a project that it seems like no one else is really doing, you're not swimming with the big school of fish, you're kind of an outlier project, you really need to make sure you have an experienced team on board until you're familiar with delivering that specific application. Because we're talking about microgrids, but a microgrid can be one Sol-Ark inverter and one battery protecting an essential load panel. In my mind, a microgrid is like a whole community with distributed power stations and transformers stepping things up on the backup side to high voltage and transmitting long distances. If you're not familiar with transformer design and its impact on, inverters, then you need to make sure you're involving professional engineers who've seen it in the field and have successfully commissioned those kinds of systems. So that's where, investing in the design process will result in a more cost-effective project. And even though you feel like you're spending more money, a precisely fine-tuned microgrid adds the most value to a project. Buying too many batteries, oversizing the solar array, those are things that if you don't address in preliminary design, it can kill the project by the time you're permitted and ready to procure. And I've seen it happen, and just failure to understand how to use the modeling software, can cause a crisis of economics. And it's really easy to sell one microgrid, but everyone here should be interested in selling multiple microgrids. So involving experienced team on the design side is a big recommendation for me.
And I would definitely echo that, and that's one of the things we've leaned into. And like I said, I wasn't trying to be super flippant with it, but there's a lot that is unknown in these projects. And even going into projects now, we are, as an engineering team, asking questions. We're constantly learning the questions that we need to be asking and prioritizing things like that. So I think partnering up with people, and then on the other part of that is the feasibility. I know I've mentioned it a few times now, but going in and understanding what this project can and can't do. Just because you're throwing a large battery at something doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to hit those demand charges, or even what the demand charges are. So going through, doing the accurate modeling, understanding what those finances look like, because there's both the technical side, can we make this work? And the answer is probably yes, but at what cost and at what savings? And so tying those two things together is really important to me, and that's exactly what we're trying to do and working with you. And then the last thing I would just say is, and I know this is preaching to the choir because you all are here, but investing in the education, investing in learning how these systems work, how they go together, what are the codes and standards that apply, and bringing all that together is really important. So those are my big things. And look at that on the time.
Yeah, we nailed it. We're right on time. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ryan. I think we've got a 30-minute break, and then the first sessions will begin right around 11. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.